Welcome back, Honors. All right. Honestly, really good job on your first quiz today. I was really impressed. Shout out to a couple kids that absolutely crushed it. Megan LaCour, Delacour, you did great. And then also Riley Cryer, killing the game. Absolutely impressed. We'll definitely update a couple of y'all with some different stuff today. And this is kind of where we left off in class today, right? We talked about our tests. We talked about the quiz. We talked about how to study properly for the class. And you'll get some practice with those things in this flip in particular, right? But the big thing about it is we left off with the Assyrians, right? And the Assyrians are going to be this culture of people that has a very long and murky and intense history throughout the Fertile Crescent area, right? So like here are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, right? And at the very height of the Assyrian Empire around 650 BC in the Iron Age, this is going to be their size. So interestingly enough, Assyrians went through actually two phases, right? They went through Assyria and then Neo-Assyria, right? Much like the Babylonians and the Neo-Babylonians. And we will mainly be focusing on the achievements of those Neo-Assyrians, right? Like how when they got to their absolute ultimate heights. But to start off, right, we had to talk about the geography, and we talked about how they're located next to the Tigris, and their empire is going to span huge modern-day territories, including Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey, right? Resources there were plentiful, and so it contributed to a very fast growth, right? And if we're going to keep talking about the geography of Assyria, you got to kind of understand it all really falls down onto this flat, exposed land that they actually lived on, right? So the big thing about it is they were at the base of the Zagros Mountains, right? And their territory and area made it very easy for them to be attacked, okay? And since they were so easily attackable, this is going to influence their culture to develop a warlike behavior, right? To have warlike behavior and constantly be on guard and be able to defend off against any enemies, but also gaining the ability to go out and attack any enemies. Because if you have the ability to repel invaders with a strong army, now you have a strong army, so you have the ability to be the invader, right? They also actually had adequate rainfall, right? Due to the fact that they were at the base of those Zagros Mountains, particularly in Nineveh and Ashur. There are like two main city-states that you can actually see on this map right here, Ashur and Nineveh. So the big thing about them is being at the base of those mountains, the rain would typically come running down the mountains and actually provide them with plentiful amounts of fresh water, right? They had very fertile land in this area and a ton of particular natural resources, particularly stone, okay? Stone resources coming from the Zagros Mountains is going to be very plentiful, but also another big thing about it is where there are mountains, where there is stone, there is typically metal. And we will talk about that a little bit later and how they had a lot of access to bronze, copper, tin, and iron as well going into the future, okay? Now, also huge major crop producing area, they produced figs, olives, pomegranates, almonds, mulberries, cottons, grains. So they were a very well-suited, well-situated, well-attributed society for extreme amounts of growth. The big kicker in this entire thing is coming up later. This part of their developing into this warlike culture, is going to be the thing that kind of jumps up and bites them in the butt a little bit later, right? And so this right here, of course, is some Assyrian art. This actually directly deals with Assyrian religion and their ruling power, right? Because this right here is Ashur, which is their national god, and this is the king of Assyria, right? Both of them being shown together. And this is due to the fact that in the ancient Assyrian religion, the king was kind of the paramount or highest ranking person, and Assur was their national god. The guy with the wings on his back, right back here, this is Assur, and he would actually be shown as representing the king's power or being a part of the king himself. So what is this exactly? That's a theocratic system, right? Much like Egypt, they had a theocracy, okay? They had a theocratic system where they believed that their king was also their highest ranking general, and their general was their highest ranking warrior, and it was their entire collaborative effort of their entire government and religion, was that their military, their government, and their religion were all intertwined together, right? So this is their theocratic system. Whereas Amun-Ra is going to be represented in the Pharaohs of Egypt, and Pharaohs of Egypt are meant to keep mot and balance. The Assyrian culture, they're expected to be warlike, right? The kings are expected to not necessarily be unbalanced, but to assert their dominance throughout the plains of which they actually lived at the time, okay? So, sorry, let me get situated, all right? But yeah, and so this is what we commonly represented this was the common representation of an Assyrian king in most of their artworks, right? So you can see a lot of very, very unique things about Assyrians through the dress, through his costuming, through also the adornments on his clothing. But the big thing about it is we're now also, so we now understand their geography, we understand their government theocratic system, and now also we're getting a little bit of a taste of their art, right? So from just looking at it alone, a lot of people can usually see that the Assyrian art is directly related to their geography, which is directly related to their theocratic system. The great thing about studying the Assyrians is we get kind of this understanding of how the geography, the environment, and the growth of a civilization is directly related to its cultural attributes, right? Because remember, we said they were at the base of the Zagros Mountains, right? So most of their art is going to be made of stone, right? Due to the fact that they had plentiful amounts of it, okay? So most of their art was usually known as recessive art, carved into stone. So what they would do is they actually would have a flat piece of stone, and the image would be raised up off of the actual image itself. And they would make this by literally chiseling away the stone layer by layer and leaving a raised image behind, okay? So stone, of course, being an important resource to the Assyrians, and there was a huge amount of it, okay? Assyrians are also going to later excel in working with bronze, which is also going to be very, very plentiful, especially in their early establishment. And later on, they're going to be very, very experienced in dealing with iron, right? Particularly when the Bronze Age collapsed and the Iron Age begins, okay? Because the old Assyrian Empire was a part of the Bronze Age, and when the Bronze Age collapsed, they went with them, down with them. And then the Iron Age saw the growth of the Neo-Babylonians and the Neo-Assyrians much later. Assyrians are also going to have their own form of writing. However, this is heavily debated historically, if they actually had a writing system of their own. Was it more adopted off of Aramaic? Was it more adopted off of Akkadian scripts? We're not really sure, but it looks almost like a blending of the two. Some historians also argue that Assyrian writing may be the basis of modern Arabic script. But again, we're not completely sure. And also, that also begs the question, did the Assyrians adopt these writing systems because they took over other people and they would then themselves culturally diffuse that into their society? And or did the Assyrians come up with this first? We're not really sure necessarily, but one of the bigger things that we are sure of course, is their artwork, right? This is a heavily reproduced image. The winged bull man. Okay, so excuse me. This is one of their gods heavily used in imagery in the Assyrian Empire very often. If you go to the Colosseum in Rome, when the Romans actually took over a territory nearby, they took one of these back with them to Rome, and he's absolutely huge, and he sits inside of the Colosseum. So another really neat thing, this right here, another very big part of Assyrian artwork, is using multiple types of stone in that recessive artwork, and also using the imagery of animals as well. Speaking of also, they would also use the imagery of their war tactics and their war stylings because remember, they were a very militaristic empire. And then speaking of the animals, they also would depict a lot of hunt scenes, right? Which of course, a militaristic empire in their art is going to depict their army and also depict the hunt, right? Because the hunt is simply another marking of their warriors when they're not in war, right? And this is a lion hunt, right? And you can actually see the arrow going into the lion's head, right? There are some pretty intense, very gruesome pieces of Assyrian artwork that actually show like dead lions and their arrows all over their back and stuff, but it's a very intense culture. But also, as you can see from their art and their religion and their entire ambiance and being, they're not, yes, they were super about their military, but this is going to bring them wealth, and this is going to bring them intelligence, and this is going to bring them an excessive amount of growth, right? So actually right here, this is some of the artifacts that they created after they took over ancient Egypt and began to adopt some of their imagery. We believe that some imagery of, there you go, kind of Mott right there is being seen. And then also this one is one of my favorite ones. This is a metal recessive carving of an Assyrian warrior on an ostrich hunt, right? Because they actually expanded all the way down into ancient Egypt, which is a very big deal. So the Assyrian culture, keep going with it though, is you gotta so we looked at their geography, we looked at their government, we looked at their economy, we looked at their art, we looked at all this other stuff. Now the big thing we gotta get behind is kind of the Assyrian cultural policies, right? So Assyrian policy was being kind of a merciless, warrior-like, very expansive army-based people, okay? Their policy was to take over an area and then force the deportation of the people that lived there into other areas of the empire to create a uniform empire where they believed rebellions weren't as likely to pop up by making these people move. And at the very beginning of talking about the Assyrians, we talked about how they did this to one particular group of people early on, and that is, of course, going to be to the Hebrews, and their forced deportation is going to lead to a part of the diaspora, right? So, excuse me. Ooh, man, that snuck up on me. But the diaspora being the spreading of those Jewish people, right? So, or the Hebrew people at the time. Now, their policy to do this was, of course, to avoid those rebellions, and also their goal was to destroy the enemy and their country's sense of nationalism, right? Because remember, if you allow these people to stay together, right? Don't write this, by the way. Don't write this. This is not necessary for you to write that. If they stay together in one area, that is going to sow the seeds of rebellion, right? And if you're a militaristic people, you're going to want to take over as many people as possible, and rebellions simply slow you down, right? Now, they were known particularly for being pretty cruel in these takeovers and these dispatchings, right? They would oftentimes skin and behead their prisoners. We talked about flaying, right, in class, actually the removal of skin, right? And also this tactic was usually a part of their culture. And they sometimes would actually picture it on their art to then further intimidate people from other empires about the Assyrian culture. This right here is actually how they were believed to have counted the dead, right? It is believed that the Assyrians would make piles of their slain enemies' heads and count each of them individually to figure out how many of their enemies had been slain in battle, right? So, of course, this is right here. This is Mr. Terry, and this is Mr. Wooderson, and here's Mr. Mathern, just counting the noggins for us, right? So the big thing about it, though, going forward, is with these policies of being super intense, super militaristic, very aggressive, and very strong, they are going to expand very quickly, right? Assyria is going to expand their strong military forces and keep their territory using extreme force, right? Between 850 and 650 BC, the Neo-Assyrians are actually going to defeat Syria, Palestine, Babylon, Egypt, the Hebrews, and take over many Phoenician trade cities, right? So they were ever expanding, quickly growing, and enforcing these militaristic policies upon the people they took over. And remember, whenever they would take a group of people over, they would force those people to dispatch themselves and move them throughout the empire so they could hopefully avoid a rebellion in the future sense, right? Now, anyway, though, getting into it, they also had the ability to do this because they began to make huge divisions of their military, okay? I've never noticed this before, but he's holding a head in his hand by the beard right there. Never even noticed that until just now, right? They had entire divisions of their military, though, right? They had shield men who are actually a part of siege warfare where they would actually create a big shield wall in front of the archers who would be standing behind them. And then you would also have further, they would have raiding soldiers that would actually be on foot, usually led by men like this, right? And they also, again, would use some of this extreme merciless tactics as kind of like propaganda. It's very hard to see right here. Very, very difficult. But we believe that this piece of art was created after the Assyrians took over a Jewish settlement, right? And during this takeover, they actually took some of the Jewish leaders and then took posts, wooden posts, that are like anywhere from 6 to 12 feet long, usually closer to 12 feet long, and sharpen the ends of them to a point, and then insert the post inside the sternum of one of their enemies, and actually the post itself would then sit right here inside of their body, and they would prop them up for a warning sign for the people that they were taking over, right? And these artworks and these recessed carvings made their ways all over the entire empire, again, to keep the people they were taking over living in fear. And to go even further, now you can kind of see what I was talking about with the different divisions of the Assyrian military. You had their archers, shield men. This right here is a group of raid soldiers operating a battering ram that would be used to knock into the walls of a city and bring the walls down, eventually opening up a hole so they could go inside and actually take the entire area over. These are really, really cool, though. These guys right here, they were actually called Sappers as being a part of the Assyrian military. They would dig underneath a wall, right, to weaken the structural integrity of the wall. So when that ram came up, actually image right there, it would be able to knock into the wall and take it down completely. So they had men tunneling underground underneath the wall of a city they were trying to attack, removing the dirt to create a weaker walled fortress so the wall could easily be knocked down. So they could, again, get inside the area, get inside the village, get inside the kingdom, and take it down from the inside, right? And this right here, of course, is a ceremony of execution of, again, within the Assyrian Empire, of flaying. This is, as you can see, the hands and the wrists are tied, the wrists and the ankles are tied to posts. The victim would be stretched out, and they would use a knife and cut around the neck, down the t-shirt line, around the wrists, around the ankles, and then reach in underneath the skin and peel the skin off to try and make these people into an example, again, always to prevent a future rebellion. Even though, ironically enough, what's really, really dumb is you would, like, looking at it this way, you're like, wait a minute, isn't this going to make people want to rebel against you even more? But we'll get to that here in a minute, okay? Now, the Assyrian military, though, to keep going, the Assyrian army was the largest standing army that the world had ever seen in the Middle East or the Mediterranean up to this point, right? Up until about the 6th century BC. Now, later on, the Persians are going to grow their military even larger, using some Assyrian-style tactics, but doing it in a better way. And we'll explain that a little bit later. Now, not only did the Assyrians have advanced technology, but they also used great tactics, right? The army would, like, actually use rams to, slam into city walls. Assyrian troops would use ladders and throw those up against city walls to climb up and into a city stronghold, while archers are launching arrows over the wall the entire time to keep the city people suppressed and, like, ducking down. Oh, and hey, look, they're right here. They're the Sappers, right? The Assyrian army also used these people called Sappers. Sappers were soldiers that dug tunnels underneath to sap the origins of the enemy's wall so they would weaken and fall, right? So these are a couple of things that you can jot down real quick. I'll mainly be asking you to describe some of the, this will actually probably be a short answer, mainly asking you to describe some of the Assyrian military tactics. But if you want to go ahead and hit pause and just kind of go ahead and get these things, because I actually did spend a long time talking about the stuff on the last slide, right? Now, but I'm going to keep going to just try and not take up too much of your time, right? Now, look, do not write this, just write this. So to keep going further, though, the Assyrian army was extremely organized, right? They had tons of specialized units. They had personal security for the king, archers, spearmen, rams, foot soldiers. One of my most favorite things to talk about with these particular army divisions has to do with the fact that there was another group of Assyrian soldiers that if there was a river between the Assyrian army and a city that they were trying to take over, they would have a fleet of engineers, right? And the engineers would build pontoons, right? And a pontoon is like a big inflated, let me put it to you this way. A pontoon boat is a boat that sits on top of two huge inflated steel drums, right? Or steel cylinders. So now they're not going to be able to necessarily create pontoons out of steel at this time period, but they did in fact make pontoons out of animal hides, right? They would tie inflated animal hides together, creating these big bags, right? And since, like, as we know, mammal skin is pretty close to impermeable, they would be able to then blow the animal hides up into like a balloon and tie them off and then use those to hold up a bridge to cross a river. They would also then sometimes, if it was a greater river and too big to build a bridge across, many of the Assyrian military forces would actually take these animal skins, blow them up, put one up underneath their arm, and literally swim over to attack the city that rested on the side of another river. How ridiculous is that? They're either going to build a bridge on their own, or they are going to show up with like basic life jackets and raid your city, even if you are an island isolated in the middle of a river or a lake. That is absolutely wild to me. So going further, though, of course, the Assyrian, excuse me, I need to slow down. I need to take a breath, right? The Assyrians are also going to organize their conquered territories into a massive empire, right? So not only are they going to expand and grow, but they are also then going to take the places that they took over and subdivide it. Now, some of y'all messed up on this quiz a little tiny bit today because y'all forgot that the Pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, Djoser, was the one that divided the kingdoms up into a system called nomes, right? So the Assyrians are going to do something much like that. They're going to subdivide their empire into provinces, and then the Assyrian kings in their theocratic system would pick or select governors to actually control or like monitor those specific provinces, right? So Assyrian kings would do this with dependent territories that supported the rulers, and Assyrians would protect the dependent territories from invasions, right? If a conquered territory refused to pay their taxes, the Assyrian military would arrive and execute large numbers of civilians until the taxes were paid, right? If there were any signs of a rebellion, Assyrians would show up with their military and crush any signs of rebellion and or execute people believed to be associated with that rebellion. They used violence to get things done. They used violence to encourage people to pay taxes and to crush any signs of rebellion. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to be deported to work as slave laborers in the Assyrian home cities or as conscripts of their army. That's another huge thing. They're going to basically draft people that they have taken over into their army by force, right? So to keep their army stock completely huge. Now, they also, though, had great use of technology in the Assyrian military. Big things include chariots, of course, right? Now, we do believe that the chariots, we're not necessarily positive of who invented them first, but we do know that the Hyksos had access to them, or something that looked a lot like a chariot, and that is going to culturally diffuse over into the ancient Egyptians. But the Assyrians actually had perfected the chariot and would use it as a quick means of transportation, and would also use it as a very, very effective use of a cavalry force in the military. They would use chariots to just ride down entire cities and run through gates of cities or town walls and use it in their raids. Right here, you can actually see the Assyrians on their war chariot, and this is from the 9th century BC, and this man has lost his head under the foot of the horses, right? So chariots is going to be a massive thing, but another big piece of their technology is going to be the use of iron, right? Following the Bronze Age collapse, right? Following the Bronze Age collapse, when the first Assyrian Empire fell right along with the New Kingdom Egyptians and several other groups, like including some of the Hittites and some of the the leftover Hyksos, and as well as the Mycenaeans, who were actually out in Greece. With the Bronze Age collapse, you're going to see the adoption of iron. Now, the Assyrians are going to become some of the very first ancient peoples to notice the quality and efficiency of iron over bronze. Bronze is an alloy made of copper and tin mixed together, whereas iron is a pure elemental metal, and it is stronger, it holds an edge for longer, and it's also much more durable, right? So this was another piece of their technology on top of the chariots that they would also use, right? And then this is the very, very last slide, and this is it for this flip. And we crushed an entire civilization in about 25 minutes, right? So that is very impressive. Make sure you kind of go back and you read through this stuff a little bit. We will review these guys very heavily to make sure that you know all that you need to know about them. But the problem with the Assyrians, and the reason why they would eventually fall, is because they just made too many enemies, right? When you're using fear to control an entire empire, it's simply a matter of time until someone rises up and destroys you back, right? And they were destroyed by a huge group of rebelling cultures who all attacked at the exact same time. Mostly led, though, by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, right? So when the Neo-Babylonians arrived, they were the ones that mushed the Assyrians back down, and then when the Assyrians rose up again later on, the Persians would actually come in, and Cyrus the Great would take them over while the rebellious factions were overthrowing the Assyrian government as well. Assyria is eventually going to crumble and give way for the Persian Empire. It's going to be the group that we're going to talk about in our next class. I'll talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good one.